Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibiers? Welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. I'm home. Feels good to be back. Had a great week in Boise. I'm going to get into that here in just a second. But first, if you're watching on YouTube, you know the drill. Don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Like the video, share it with your friends, and you can ring my bell if you want notifications of when I post new content. Click that little bell icon. Music fact of the day. The Red Hot Chili Peppers song Danny California faced a lot of controversy after it shares a common format with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers song Mary Jane's Last Dance. It also featured the same producer, Rick Rubin. When asked if Tom Petty was going to sue the Red Hot Chili Peppers, he says, "I don't believe in lawsuits much. I think there are enough frivolous lawsuits in this country without people fighting over pop songs." I love Tom Petty. Gone too soon. He's one I never got to see live, but wish I had. It was an interesting week in Boise. You know, from the beginning of this trial, I really wanted to be there when his kids testified. After attending Lori's trial for 6 weeks last year, a lot of people thought this was just going to be a carbon copy. I never thought that, and we've been proven right. We've gotten to see some dash cam video. We've heard some phone calls we never heard. So a lot really fits into this big puzzle and clears up a lot of things. But I really wanted to be there when his kids testified, and I picked the very first witness on the very first day I was back in that courtroom was Emma Daybell. It was so interesting to be in there when both of his kids testified, seeing the difference in the connections between Emma and Garth. Chad and Emma exchanged grins several times. He watched her testimony, but when Garth was on the stand, he really didn't look up, and Garth didn't look at him very much either. Yesterday was very big as far as Garth goes, with a rebuttal witness who testified what Garth told him when Tammy passed away. We'll get to that towards the end of this episode. It's always good to reconnect with everybody, even though it's not under the best circumstances. I always say the silver lining in all of this are the friendships that are formed where you never would have met each other. And we all wish we'd have never met under these circumstances. But if you can grab something pretty out of all this ugly, take it and run. And I see it every day in those relationships there, standing in line in the hallways. Really just a beautiful thing. I decided to change my flight from Saturday to yesterday. I just had a feeling with John Pryor only having one remaining witness to put on the stand before he rested. Did not anticipate Chad was going to testify, although I did have the Delta app open, ready to change that flight should he have taken the stand. But by the time I was on the plane, court was out for the day. Obviously, there's no court today, none on Monday. We'll be back Tuesday with more rebuttal. I believe it's going to take a day and a half, 2 days to do that. We could very well have a verdict by next week. Remember, these jurors have to be sequestered for their deliberations. What were my impressions of the jury? I think the jury is super attentive. The only time I really saw them lose interest was when the defense witness was on the stand that was going through those phone pings. And a couple of times when they said, "Well, you don't have Chad's phone on his property," you saw a couple of jurors very subtly react to that. Kind of like, yeah, okay, that don't make no sense. But let's jump into the last defense witness from yesterday and the rebuttal. This was day 29, and the witness is Dr. Eric Bartelink. He's a forensic anthropologist. He establishes identity and specializes in burned remains and post-mortem alterations. He was asked to analyze Tylee's remains. So he came to Rexburg on December 18th. And just a trigger warning, we are going to talk about some of the things in his testimony that is not pleasant about Tylee's remains. So if you're sensitive to that, you might want to click off here. They sorted the remains into an anatomical position and they did inventory of the bones they had and what was missing. They did a trauma analysis to look for any kind of defects or modifications. In total, there were 3 forensic anthropologists working on this, and it took them about 6 to 7 hours to examine all the remains. If you're watching on YouTube, up on the feed here, there is a graphic of the front and back of a skeletal system. The ones that are shaded in black are the ones that were missing on Tylee. Some of the bones that were not present: partial skull from the left eye socket and the back of the skull, almost all of the right arm except the shoulder and part of the right forearm, A large portion of the ribs missing. There was some of the right leg missing. The left leg was almost absent completely, except for a few small fragments. And there were some remains that were just so fragmented and destroyed that they couldn't determine if they were human or animal or what they belonged to. He talks about how they used donors to test fire damage on cadavers. They said they set up a funeral pyre, just kind of a large bonfire using pallets as that heat source. It would be multiple pallets with a section cut out. Pryor asked if gasoline would be a good source, and the witness says it's not enough to sustain combustion for a very long time. You would usually need something more in large quantity over a long period of time to reduce the size of the body. Although, if you remember when Detective Hermosillo was testifying, the smell of the accelerant was so bad, they were only able to go in for a couple of minutes at a time when they were retrieving Tylee's remains on the day of the search warrant. He asked, would the use of fire explain why you don't have a complete skeleton? And the witness says there were some bones that couldn't be identified. But he said a fire typically would not destroy the bones that were missing. Based on the burn pattern, the most likely possibility is the body was burned as a whole and not in pieces. There's no way to determine how long it took to put her remains in the manner in which they were found. You have to remember, though, she was killed in September. This search warrant was not until June of 2020. That's a long time to be able to do what you want. And you consider also these remains were not found in a very deep grave, they were very shallow. His team did not see the evidence of scavenging. It could have been related to the burning process. Pryor asked, can you say where she was burned? He doesn't know. That was one of those times where the jury reacted in sort of a okay kind of way. He can't say much other than he thinks the body was burned intact. He can't say if she was burned and then placed in Chad's backyard, which makes no sense. But on cross, the witness did look at the autopsy and reviewed FBI reports. When he compared his findings to prior witness Dr. Christensen, he found no difference in opinion. It's not possible to estimate a time of how long it would take to burn remains. There's just too many unknown variables. The witness said it's possible she was burned there. It's also possible she was burned elsewhere. I highly doubt it. They did a search warrant on Alex's truck and didn't find really anything of evidentiary value in there as far as biological evidence. So y'all do the math. There's a burn pit there. Come on. Not all bones were found by the FBI. They typically expect to find large portions of bone after the burning process. The fragments they were unable to identify could have been those bones. Then they ask, is it possible there are still bones on Chad Daybell's property? And the witness said yes. They did find a number of the remains had blunt force defects. The left jawbone had been fractured in 6 different places, and there were fractures from blunt force trauma. They can't say if that was before or after death. There was blunt force trauma also to the skull, the sternum, and the ribs. There were those sharp defects on the hip bones, the cervical spine, and the sacrum. Sharp force defects. As far as that, the witness cannot exclude shovels or pickaxes. We know Tylee's DNA and biological evidence were found on both of those. Some of those injuries could have been from a chopping force, and machetes cannot be excluded. If you remember in the search warrant at Lori's townhouse, they did find swords that Alex had there. The rib fractures, at least 2 of those were consistent with blunt force trauma. In total, he found 18 sharp force injuries and 16 blunt force impacts. On a redirect, no distinguishable way to say where the blunt force trauma took place. No. And that was it. They did have a hearing outside the presence of the jury. This revolved around calling back Deputy Coulter Cannon, who responded to the attempt on Tammy Daybell's life on October 9th. They wanted to bring him back to dispute Joe Murray's testimony. That's the son-in-law of Tammy Daybell, the husband of Emma. Joseph Murray denied that he told Deputy Cannon that he heard Tammy scream. Also, the Daybell said that this deputy went inside and looked at photos of possible paintball guns with Tammy, which he denies he did. The state essentially said that these witnesses were calling Coulter Cannon a liar, but he has watched testimony of the trial since he was released from his subpoena. Judge Boyce said that he would not permit him to come back and testify. I don't think that you really need that, to be honest. Joe Murray came across as so anti law enforcement. I watched the jury during Joe Murray's testimony. They were not very receptive to it. I can say that. We move on now to rebuttal, and they bring in a witness, Lisa Jensen. She worked at Central Elementary with both Emma and Tammy. She supervises the paraprofessionals, and she's the Title I representative. She actually hired Emma initially at the school, and she saw Tammy on a regular basis. She said they were friends and colleagues. She would see her a few times a week. She said Tammy ran the library. She was their computer specialist, and Tammy was their go to if they needed something done and no one knew what to do or no one had done it. She saw Tammy doing very normal things. Tammy's on her feet a lot, back and forth between the library and the computer lab. She did recess duty. She's all over the school, very busy. She said Tammy was well and healthy and strived to keep herself that way. One thing that always stuck out was even if Tammy wore a dress, she wore tennis shoes to get those steps in. The witness never saw Tammy get winded, tired. She knew Tammy wore that Fitbit. Tammy never missed work and she never seemed sick. Emma told the witness that Tammy died of a blood clot. She said that's what doctors were suspecting. On cross with John Pryor, on a weekly basis, she would have contact with Tammy 2 to 3 days a week. Once a week, they would have a little more in depth conversation. She said that could last anywhere from 5 to 30 minutes if they were eating lunch together. It wasn't often they got to do that. Pryor really presses about this once a week discussion comment, just really insinuating you don't know much because you only really talk to her once a week in depth. Tammy would come into her room more often in the mornings. There were other women who work in that room who were all readers. So Tammy would come in and discuss books and give them book recommendations. He asked if Tammy was an introvert, and the witness says not at school. She said they're all very tight knit. And Pryor says, so you would say she's outgoing? This outgoing person you meet with once a week would talk about books. And when you had these once a week meetings with Tammy, did you have those with Emma? She said no. Pryor asked about the distance from one end of the school to the other. Was it far? And the witness said that would be subjective. The witness does say she's closer with Emma and still considers Emma a close friend. He asked if she's suggesting Emma would share a very private issue with her, the witness, regarding her mother's death. The witness says it wasn't a private issue. Her mom passed away and Emma shared the cause of death with them. Pryor asked, wouldn't you consider that to be a private issue? And the witness was like, nope. The next witness, Jason McKay Badgelin, he worked with Garth at the haunted attraction during the time frame when Tammy was killed. It's a seasonal job. They open for the month of October, and that job is in Teton, Idaho. He said they worked there together for quite a few years and worked right next to each other in 2019. So if it was slow, they would talk. They became friends. They went to a few haunted houses together and they hung out at work. Garth said the weekend after Tammy died, he found her when he got home from work and did not know where Chad was. Garth told the witness Tammy was pale and her lips were blue. The witness couldn't remember if Garth said she was in the bed or not. He said they left work around 12:30 a.m. usually, and it could be later if they were busier. I think this is huge testimony because if you look at it from the perspective of this witness has no dog in the fight. This witness has no reason to get up on the stand and lie about his friend Garth. He is relaying what Garth said, which is very different to what Garth testified on Monday, saying he got home from work, saw his parents kind of silhouetted in the bed, heard his dad snoring, watched YouTube, went to bed, and then Chad woke him up. Out of all the kids that we've heard from, whether on the 2020 special or in court, Garth seems the most vulnerable. I've heard he's a very, very sweet young man, very loved at the school he works at. And I think he's in a bad position, to be honest with you guys. On cross at work, they open around 7:30. Stayed until midnight, but they couldn't leave until all customers had gone through the attraction. The first 2 weeks of October was part-time and only on the weekends. The last 2 weeks of October, they were open Monday through Saturday. Pryor asked if the witness knows what day Tammy died, and he doesn't. The witness says the next weekend after that is when he saw Garth at work and he communicated this to him. Pryor says, how do you know when you saw Garth if you don't know what day Tammy passed? It's kind of a dumb question. He may not know the date, but he may know Garth was back at work the next weekend. He says Garth did take time off, but it was that next weekend. Garth never mentioned anything about funerals or memorials, church stuff, or anything like that. Also, Garth did not tell him anything about hearing Chad snoring from the bedroom. Pryor really was trying to minimize their friendship a lot. Just, oh, so you went to a couple of haunted houses and you're close friends. Pryor was actually, to me, very rude to this young man. And I heard as much from people that were in there. I was not in there for this testimony. I was at the airport. He asked when that statement was made to him, and he said at work there were other scare actors around them. He said Garth was quiet most of that night. The witness gave Garth his condolences, and then that's when Garth told him what happened. Pryor says, so you weren't close friends? And the witness says, we were close coworkers. Pryor says, and this close coworker decided one day to disclose something very private about his mother's death. Is that right? And the witness says, yes. On a redirect, when Garth talked to you about finding his mother, how did he appear? The witness said he was sad, like something was affecting him. The prosecution asked, was Garth clear that he found his mom and his dad wasn't there? The witness says yes. And that was it for his testimony. Laura Matthias caught up with him outside of court. So go to her YouTube and check out that video. The next witness up, Detective Bruce Mattingly, he was the one that had the results of Tammy's autopsy. None of Chad's kids reached out about the results. Detective Kukumanu tried to reach out to Emma and Garth with no response or callback. So they formed a team to split up and try to make contact with each of the Daybell kids specifically to inform them about the results of the autopsy. Detective Mattingly went to Emma's school on February 18th, 2021, around 4:30 p.m. after school. Lieutenant Ron Ball went with him. They have audio of that and they played it in court. Detective Mattingly is speaking with the principal of the school. Then he catches up with Emma, saying they've been trying to get in touch with them because they have the results of their mother's autopsy. Emma very flatly says he can contact their attorney. When Mattingly asked who was representing them, she said they don't have an attorney. They've decided to learn the results when it's released. Detective Mattingly assures Emma they're not going to ask her any questions about anything. Their purpose was to share the results of their mother's autopsy. He said they can't go in depth into it because it's still under investigation, but they can discuss it with her and ask if she wants to set up a time. Emma says not right now. She'll have her attorney call him. They gave Emma the contact information for victim services and told her she can call them. And even though this is through the prosecution's office, as far as the victim's advocate, she doesn't have to speak with anybody as far as the prosecutors in this case. They tell Emma they've had problems getting a hold of anyone about the autopsy, and other law enforcement are reaching out to her siblings. Emma says, okay, thanks. He says they want her to come in to let her know about the results, and she says, thank you very much. He said he could not physically give her the report due to the ongoing investigation, but would be happy to sit down and go over it with her. She never contacted them to find out about the autopsy results. On cross, they did not tell Emma and her siblings about the autopsy results for a month due to the investigation. He said Emma did make contact with Fremont County once, and Pryor asked, why didn't he just tell her? And Mattingly said he didn't want to just throw it all out there. There are tons of objections, by the way. On a redirect, when doing a death notification, do you normally just blurt out the cause of death? And the witness says no. And he reiterates Emma never reached out to get the results of her mother's autopsy. So that was it for yesterday. And we've got more rebuttal witnesses coming up. So we'll see what happens. I think maybe towards the end of next week, we'll be into closings. We all have Crime Con on Thursday. So I know on the day we're all due to be at Crime Con, we get these closings. Fingers crossed, especially for Nate, who's been such an awesome resource for all of us who have been at home watching the trial, that he is there for closings and the verdict. I think we're getting there, y'all. Think about it. All these years later, we're finally getting resolution. Hope you guys have a good Memorial Day weekend. Don't forget to remember why we have this weekend, the sacrifices of the brave men and women that have kept us free. It's not all about the barbecues. Hope you guys have a good rest of your long weekend. We will see you soon.